Okay, so this one we're going to show how to replace your spark plugs. So on a vehicle like this, and pretty much for most modern vehicles, it's going to be easy popping off the spark plug wires. And we want to make sure that we keep them in the same order and know how they, well, okay, so for this one, we're disconnecting them at both ends. In practice, you'll probably only remove one side. Whoops. You'll only remove it from the spark plug side, but never from the coil pack, unless you're replacing the coil pack too, of which, well, if you're replacing the coil pack, then you're not remove the spark plugs. Let's move on. So, okay, I need. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that they added this. Cool. Okay, so what I'm going to do, using this socket extension. Okay, cool. So when you do this, you not that. Okay, so you just put this in, and then you just loosen it, making sure to keep it straight. You don't want to bend it or anything like that. And here we have it. The socket is, I believe, a 50 millimeter, but they have a special one for spark plugs. It has a little rubber gasket in the middle, so that way it grabs onto the back of the spark plug, so that way you can pull it out without it dropping back in place. Last thing you want. Um, so here we can see that the spark plug is actually really good. You know, there's a little gap. Obviously, in this game we don't have um, any issues. Um, so I'm just gonna put that as okay. When we put it back in, obviously we don't do it that way, but this this game it requires you to do it that way. Oh, cool, 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 cool. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna have to use this tiny one, although normally I'd be using this to make sure it's tight in there. So now I'm just going to put it on there and tighten to spec. Then I just take it out and bam, that's done. Then put in that one. Okay, so for fairness sake, I'd probably this one looks good as well. See, that's how I put it back in. Okay, so when you buy new ones, obviously this game does not include how to deal with spark plugs. So if it comes with multiple um, ground terminals, then odds are it's going to be something that you can't adjust. But the spark plug gap for something like this where it just has a single ground terminal, you will need a little spark plug gap. It'll typically be like a little circle, and it goes from, I don't know, 20 thousandths of an inch all the way up to 80 thousandths of an inch. And typically, you look at what your car specifies. It'll probably be, you could either Google that answer, like, what is the spark gap for my car, the car's year, make, and model. Or you can look in the manual, if you still have it, to find out what's the ideal spark gap for this. Alright, so since it no longer wants to go on there, I have to do it this way. And then once you have that on there, carefully reinsert it into the socket and then slide it back in place. Be careful, you don't want to drop it or anything like that. Make sure that this thing is perfectly balanced. You want it perfectly perpendicular. You don't want it at an angle because then you might cross the threads or damage the threads. And the last thing you want is to damage the threads on an engine block, or more specifically the head. That would just end in a bad time. So don't do that. Now I need to get this little guy. Okay, so that's how you do that. Pretty simple, Anyone can remove the spark plugs off their car. Now, I'm wondering whether I should take off the head so that way you can see that as well. Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. I'm just going to take these off again. So now, okay, so first off, what? Damn it. Okay. So for this, there's an order to tighten, and ideally, the way I do it is as well as loosening. So what? So this one is a tad different to what I'm used to. That's okay. Now I'm looking at the manual or the guide on here, just make sure that I follow the exact same way that I would. It's kind of like measure twice, cut once type of thing. Same concept. Okay. Almost done. This is just the valve cover though. But from here, we will see the valves, the camshafts, and the valve springs. So yeah, just a little nice thing to see. Okay, so I'm taking this off. As you can see, there's the bottom side of it. And as you can see, no spark plugs are in here because that's just the channel. They actually go down into the block. This part is um, the head. Now, it can be called heads, but typically that's reserved for vehicles that are going to be in the V or W pattern, where they'll have more than one. For a straight an inline engine, like this four-cylinder, or a straight six, a straight eight, a straight five, or a straight three, all of them are going to be a single head. So here we could actually tool belt. Let's take this little thing. No. Yes. So if I rotate the if I rotate this around, you could see how the camshafts rotate. Obviously this is going to be the intake and this is going to be the exhaust. Not 100%. Okay, so that's the cam angle sensor. Since these are all connected by a timing belt. Now this is not a serpentine belt. Serpentine belt is reserved for your accessories like your water pump or um, oil pump. No, not oil pump. Um, Power steering, that's what I was thinking of. Alternator, air conditioning. That's going to be your accessories, and those are going to be on the serpentine belt. Now, back in the day, it used to be a V belt, which is a whole different style. See, serpentine belts, they have these like 4 to 6 grooves that grip onto the pulleys. And as you can see, this one, the the crankshaft balancer, I believe it's called. Uh, yeah, the harmonic balancer. That is where the serpentine belt or belts are connected to. Now, the timing belt is also connected to that, but not to the harmonic balancer, but more or less to the crankshaft itself. And as you can see, it's perpendicularly ribbed as opposed to parallel ribbed. This controls the timing of your crankshaft, which is spinning the pistons, moving them up and down, and it is coordinating with the intake and exhaust camshafts in this case, or just a single camshaft if it's OHV or single overhead cam. So that way the valves are activating at the proper time. So, what the hell? Get off. Okay, so, as you can see here, when you're building your own engine, you can't just have it set up in any position because you want to make sure that the crankshaft and the camshafts are all in synchron. Um, they're all synchronized. So, for example, here you can actually see an I and an E. Now you might be wondering, what the hell is that? But if you look on the camshaft pulleys, you can actually see their letters out there. Here we see an E, Z, Y, U, and an I. So we make sure that the gap on there where it has the E and there's like a little bulge on there is in line with the E on this one. And then for this side, this one says an I. So instead of having the E down here, you make sure that the I is in position, and bam, there you go. There's your synchronizing. Um, so yeah. Okay, so this right here is your water pump, and this one is probably just an electronic with a little attachment on the front because honestly, there's no serpentine belt on here. But normally you would have your water pump and then you'd have a pulley that's bolted onto this. So that way you have a pulley that you have a belt that's going to that and powering the water pump. And in this game it looks like there isn't one. So that's okay, I guess. Okay, so apparently this thing doesn't want me to do the cutaway toggle. That's fine, whatever. Um, but yeah, I kind of don't want to take this apart because even though this is really straightforward, all you have to do is just remove the bolts on each side, making sure that you keep them in order because last thing you want to do is put them in the wrong order. So as you can see here, we start from the center and then work our way around, essentially like a spiral. And we work our way all the way around. Remove this as well. And then you're also going to have to remove the belt, which means you have to remove this because, well, in real life you could technically just pull this belt over and then be able to take everything off. But in this game, you have to take off the harmonic balancer and remove the crankshaft bolts and take that all off so that way you can take this off. And hopefully you make sure that the camshafts are in the same order when you take them off. And down here, the crankshaft hasn't moved either because the last thing you want is for the crankshaft to be rotated after you remove the timing belt. Because if you put everything back on as you had it, but the crankshaft has already turned, then it's no longer in synchronized, and then you're going to have engine problems. You may have the intake opening before it's supposed to, or the exhaust opening before it's supposed to, and you may have like um, backfire or lack of compression. There's so many things that can go wrong, and all these things can cause a lot of damage to your engine depending on how badly you have it untimed. And if it's really bad, then those valves could pop open just as the piston's coming in and just smash into those valves, and now next thing you know you have broken valves and they're being crushed in the cylinders and they're leaving debris and just scraping up the entire engine block, and then you're done. Anyway, not to leave it in a too much of a negative view, honestly. Just wanted to let you know that when you're dealing with these things, it's very important to keep track of how you're taking things apart and to put it back together the exact same way as you took it apart so as to avoid any possible repercussions. I mean, it's kind of common sense, you know. So, anyway, um I'm just gonna go ahead and put this back on because I'm not feeling doing all this all over again. So let me go ahead and okay. So I want 7.5 Newton meters. 7.5. And now we're gonna go from the exact center, like it shows. Tighten. Now, one thing that I would do in real life that I don't have to do in this game is because in here, once it's tight, it's tight. Um, yeah, see, it doesn't do anything. Anyway, I would put in the bolts and tighten them down not 100% to the required torque spec, but just do like halfway just so they're kind of in, and then finish all of them. And then once they're done, then go ahead and go back, doing the same pattern over again, torquing them to spec. So that way you ensure that you get an even, how would you call it? An even distribution of torque all around. Because, well, let's put it this way. If I were to torque these right here to their torque spec, then it's going to kind of off-center this a little bit, maybe just by little micrometers. And then by the time I get to this one and I start pushing that down, it may require more torque just to get a proper seal. And then, or it may not even be possible. So therefore, it's going to be at a very slight amount of unevenness, and then now you have a whole new problem on your hand. So that's why I would recommend just doing a light tightening as you go, and then torque to spec after you have all the bolts in. Come on. Nevertheless, doing these kind of things is quite calming depending on your view on doing this kind of stuff. And if you're stressed out doing this kind of work, then you're probably going to be stressed out doing this and not feel the same way as I would, for instance. Okay, so now I just put those in. And last but not least, the fourth one. Bam, bam, bam. Not too shabby. Okay, so I guess one more thing to do is I would say like every week to maybe once a week or once per 2 weeks or maybe even once a month. Just check your fluids, you pop open the power steering fluid that's going to be down here, or it really depends on the car itself. Older vehicles, they may have it right over here because it's powered by the pulleys. Others, they're electronic, so you may have it over here or over here. It's going to be somewhere. Just look for power steering, or it'll show like a little steering wheel. You just check that, make sure it's at proper range, at close to max. It doesn't have to be at max, but as long as it's close to it, that's good enough. Then check your brake fluid, extremely important. Last thing you want is to not have brakes when you really need it. And then, of course, your coolant. This one is just a radiator, but usually most commercial cars, they're going to have a reservoir, which is just called an overflow reservoir. The car doesn't really need it, but, it makes things easier-ish, I guess. So that could be over here or over here, somewhere. It'll say a max, a min, and make sure that when the engine is cold, it's at the proper level. Now, one thing to note is that when it comes to the coolant, you pretty much never want to check it when the engine is hot. Because what happens to water when it's hot, like very hot? It can convert to steam and it expands. But if it's in a closed environment, it may stay as a liquid, but now it has a lot more pressure built up in there. And when there's a lot more pressure, the second you take off a cap, it could just blow out, expanding into steam while also taking out some water, and it will burn. Uh, I know of some mechanics that they've accidentally popped one of those things open and they got burns on them. They had to go to the hospital. Um, yeah, so always be very careful, and you can never be too careful when it comes to those things. Not only that, just thinking about it, but when you have a blown head gasket, that can also increase the pressure in your coolant system to such a degree that your cap on your radiator or even your overflow reservoir can burst, spewing a coolant and obviously oil because the oil has gotten into the coolant as well. Spew it all over. It'll get all over your intake, your engine bay, and it's just a big mess. And you'll see smoke coming out of your car. I've seen that in the past, so you always want to be careful when it comes to coolant. Um, and always check your oil. You want to make sure that it looks nice. You don't want, like a dark brown, kind of translucent. Well, is translucent. Um, but you don't want it to be black, and you don't want it to be like crud, essentially, because that means that, you know, you've probably gone way beyond the lifespan of your oil because oil, you get an oil change every like 3 to 7,000 miles. It all depends on what kind of oil you're using. If you're using conventional, or if you're using synthetic blend, or if you're using full synthetic, and if you're using like long lifestyle oil, that has extra properties in order to make it last longer, you know, it really all depends. Next, um, I would say also check the transmission fluid. Obviously, there's not a meter here for this, um, but you'll have one. It'll be the one that's not marked engine oil. um, that one, however, while for the engine, you want to check it when it's cold for the engine oil because that's when it settles. For the transmission, you actually want the engine to be hot. So you turn it on, let the car run until it reaches operating temperature, and then you go ahead and check the transmission fluid. Now, the dipstick, for some vehicles, it may have two sections for it. One for when the engine's hot, and then one for when the engine's cold. I'd rather just make sure the engine's hot and then check then, because what if your car doesn't have it and you just, eh, you know what I mean? It's just like, screw it, just go ahead and turn it on, you know? Always check your brake pads. That's going to be a lot longer duration. You're not going to want to um, take your tire off every week or two just to check it because honestly, brake pads last a good while. Now, if you're braking and your steering is shaking from that, and only when you're braking, then you'll probably want to take the tire off and make sure, like, that your brake pads aren't damaged or if your rotors are warped, because that's a bad thing right there. Um, I think that's probably about it for this episode. Yeah, hopefully that was helpful and instructional. I am out.
Mic off.